Welcome again to this series on asana practice. In the last video, we talked about the benefits that accrue to us through practicing asana. What I'd like to do today is to add to that to a certain degree, and I guess to highlight one of the common modern pitfalls with regards to solely being focused on most of the benefits that we talked about in the last video. That is to say, the physiological benefits that we so often associate with yoga, such as the strength and stability, the calming of the nervous system, the ability to be more flexible and more supple in the body. What is important to understand is that those benefits are actually byproducts of the practice. They are not actually the goals or the aim of the practice if we're really looking at the full path of yoga. I've mentioned this in other videos a number of times, but just to state here very clearly that the ultimate goal of yoga is this liberation from suffering. And therefore, anything that we practice has to be focused ultimately in that direction. It's not to say that it's not great that these other byproduct benefits arise or emerge, but it's also very, very important that we try to understand that those are not truly, on the yogic path, the reasons why we practice. One of the reasons this is so important to understand is because if we tend to think of asana purely as a physical practice, we can end up getting lost in, addicted to, and even compromised by pursuing asana practice. Because what we'll end up doing is pushing ourselves physically harder and harder, more and more intense. We can become obsessed with perfecting the physical forms of asana and the physical postures, looking at pictures in books, perhaps looking to replicate the way that our teacher looked in a posture. And before we know it, what's happened is we've become even more attached to the body. We've become even more materialistic, we might say, in terms of wanting our body to be perfect in a kind of Instagram pose or Instagram posture, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, we lose sight of the longer term aim and the longer term goal of our yoga practice. The challenge with this is that what happens is that actually we end up creating more habits, what are known as samskaras, latent impressions in the mind, that continue to push us towards seeking from the external world, towards seeking intensity, and from trying to have a perfect body, for example, or a perfect physiological system, which in itself creates an attachment to something which in the long term can't be sustained, and as a result of that causes more and more suffering. So when we think of asana practice or yoga in inverted commas as a physical practice that is designed purely to make us more healthy and to give us a challenge of getting into all of these interesting and wonderful postures, if that is disconnected from the roots of the philosophy and this long-term aim of liberation and an understanding of how our asana practice actually helps contribute towards that movement on the path towards liberation and the reduction of the kleshas, the reduction in these afflictions that cause us to suffer, then that fundamentally will cause us a problem both in the short term and in the long term of our practice. And that's actually one of the most challenging things about modern yoga, particularly modern yoga, for example, in the physical setting of studios or gyms. There's a potential for a possibility for the focus to be so much on the physical that everything else kind of gets swept aside and everything else kind of gets lost in this pursuit of these postures and so on. And what I often say to people that I teach, and one of the things that I really learned when I came into connection with this Krishnamacharya system of yoga, is that actually one really doesn't need to practice a huge variety of asanas in order to get both a physiological effect, but in order to actually help us develop and move forward into the other limbs of yoga. So for example, once you've mastered or are comfortably able to practice, let's say 30 or 40 asanas, one has to really ask the question whether it's even necessary to practice anything beyond that, some of the more intricate or more difficult to practice. Yes, if you're very, very young and very, very supple, and these practices come about, or these postures come about quite easily physiologically, then potentially that's okay. And that's really the way that Krishnamacharya taught kind of younger children. But by the time you get to your 40s, by the time you get to my age, and particularly when you've started yoga later on in life, there is only so much that I'm able to achieve with my physical body. And if I continue to try to fight with my body, all that does is create more tension, more expectation, potentially more disappointment. And as a result of that, my asana practice can end up having the opposite effect to the effect that we are guided towards in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, this goal of liberation. So therefore, what's important to understand at this point is, yes, asana is important. Yes, asana helps us to develop these physiological benefits, but really those are byproducts as we move towards a more concentrated state, as we move into a more subtle state of connection with our breath, and gradually we bring down the rajasic or the uncontrolled energetic movement within our body, and we also reduce the lethargy in our body so that we can become more still and more clear, have more clarity when we practice meditation and the deeper inner limbs of practice. To finish today, I'd just like to mention that the third chapter, of which there are four, the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras talks about the siddhis, or the powers that the yogi can attain by undertaking certain practices. So for example, if you meditate on a particular form, then you gain a certain benefit. If you meditate on a different form, then you gain a different power, an ability to know the cosmos, an ability to know the thinking of another person, the ability to know the future and the past, and so on and so forth, through very specific sadhana, very specific practice. But Patanjali warns us and reminds us that if we're practicing specifically for these goals, or specifically for these powers to be attained, then ultimately we're going to get lost in them, and we're going to lose sight of the goal of actually releasing us from suffering, and we're actually going to end up creating more suffering for ourselves and for others. So although in this case he's talking about siddhis, we can also see that the benefits arising from asana can also be termed as siddhis, and therefore if we get lost in them, if we become obsessed with them, if we become addicted to them in and of themselves, it steers us away from developing on the path. So we can all make sure that we take heed and we notice this warning that Patanjali gives us, because we are all so prone to falling into that trap. Thank you once again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you again in this next series of videos on asana. Namaste.